Chapter 4. Bad, Angie's voice said of Lariat's condition. They'd arrived, she reported, on scene to find him lying on his back in a puddle of blood. Single gunshot wound to the chest. Pistol in his hand. He could hear the siren. He gonna make it? Don't know yet. Breathless. Was anybody else there? Sign of a fight? We ain't seen nobody, and the place ain't look like no struggle. We left his gun on the floor. Silas switched ears with his cell phone. In his headlights, the slick black top, two-lane ribboned up and down the raised hills like film unspooling, the Jeep riding the land. Anything else? He asked. Not that we noticed. We was kind of busy, though. I know you was, sweetie. Thanks for going. You coming to the hospital? She asked, and he knew she'd hang around if she could. Maybe get coffee with him in the cafeteria. No, I'm going over to Art's. Get a look around. See you tonight at the bus? Might be hard. Damn, I hope so. He laughed. It ain't no telling how late I'll be out there. Next he called French, in his office in Folsom. The chief was chewing. You shitting me? He said. No, I ain't. Shot in the chest. Rains and pours, don't it? French sounded annoyed. How'd they know to go out yonder? Silas slowed for a log truck in front of him, on the road, its longest tree with limbs that still bore a few shivering needles. I sent them. A long beat. You sent them? Yeah. French waited. Well? He hesitated, aware of the word he was about to use. On a hunch. A hunch? What are you, Shaft? Silas fed him the chain of events. Shit, 32, French said. Track a cloud of buzzards to a floater in the morning and follow a hunch to attempted murder in the afternoon. You after my job. Silas signaled and passed the log truck, waving an absent hand out the window. Just a pay raise. But Art might be more than attempted murder. Right. Chewing. Maybe we'll get lucky and he won't make it. Got an oyster po' boy, Chief? Shrimp, smart ass, he belched. Damn, I can smell that shit through the phone. I'll go to the hospital, French said. Get a look at the victim. You boogie on over to your friends and I'll get there when I can. And don't touch nothing. He rogered and hung up, relieved not to have to go see Larry. By now it was darker, and he turned on his lights, past a run-down house with an old black man under his porch light in a rocking chair, smoking a cigarette. Silas beeped his horn, and the man waved back. Though Larry's shop was on the outskirts of Folsom, he lived near the community of Amos, just within Silas's jurisdiction. People from larger towns always thought Chabot was small, but it was a metropolis compared to Amos, Mississippi, which used to have a store, but even that was closed now. A few paved roads and a lot of dirt ones, a land of sewer ditches and gullies stripped of their timber, and houses and single wides speckled back in the clear cut like moles revealed by a haircut. The train from Meridian used to stop there, but now it just rattled and clanged on past. Amos's population had fallen in the last dozen years, and most people remaining were black folks who lived along Dump Road. Silas's mother had lived there, too, for a while, in the trailer the bank had repossessed. These days, the population had declined to 86. He thought of M&M. 85. He slowed at a little bridge, saw the sign. Welcome to Amos. A little farther, he turned left onto Lariat Road. Since 9/11, for response to possible terrorism, every road, even dirt ones, had to be named or numbered. In this case, the sign was always gone because teenagers kept stealing them. Silas braked, signaled, and turned, his light sweeping Larry's beat-up mailbox into sight and back out as he tunneled through the darkness with his high beams, a road he hadn't seen for over 2 decades. A quarter-mile farther, he passed the old Walker place, where Cindy Walker, the girl who disappeared, had lived. The house nothing but a slanting shanty and weeds, roof sinking, windows boarded up, porch fallen in. Somebody had stolen the concrete block steps, His tires slid on the dirt and he slowed, fishtailing, writing, looking for other tire tracks and seeing the ambulances and the trucks, probably Larry's, intersecting and coming apart like something untwining. Dirt roads were a blessing when it came to investigating a crime scene. Silas had worked a few cases with French, couple burglaries and assaults, and one murder about a year ago. Watched French use his black magnetic powder to lift prints, his distilled water and cotton balls to collect blood samples. It was nothing like movies or television, where they dug moths out of the victim's mouth with tweezers. Mostly it was just being careful and looking. A hair in the sink, a fingernail snagged in a rug. He stopped at Larry's house under a clearing sky. No stars yet, but half a bright yellow moon lodged in the trees across the field. He pulled on a pair of latex gloves and got out and aimed his flashlight. A lot of mud. A lot of footprints. Larry's truck was parked by the driveway, its door closed. He wished it was light so he could see better. It was too easy to muck up a crime scene in the dark. Never knew what you'd step on. Not a bad case for waiting till morning. Of course, the fresher the evidence was, the better, especially fingerprints. But he didn't have a kit for that kind of detective work, and it wasn't his job anyway. That's why they paid French the big bucks, $14 an hour. He checked out the truck first, driver window down. He laid the back of his hand on the hood. Cold. Rain had gotten in the cab, but he didn't close the window, knew it was better to leave things the way they were. He turned, glad the rain had stopped. But before he went to the house, he clicked off his light and stood breathing the night air, listening to the far cry of a whippoorwill and the pulse of crickets all around. The house, small, wood, painted white, had a raised foundation and railed front porch, screened windows across the facade. He scraped mud from his boots on the bottom step of the sidewalk that led to the porch and walked up the steps. He paused a moment. There was a rocking chair with a cushion, and he imagined Larry here each evening, the other half of the porch empty. He pulled the screen door open and held it with his hip, turned the front door knob with 2 fingers, this among the best places for prints. It was unlocked, and he creaked it into the room with the heel of his hand and ran his light over the floor and saw it reflected in the puddle of blood. Pistol off to the side. Bloodied grip. He stepped in, located the switch and turned on the light, and the room resumed itself, clean in its corners and dusted. An ancient television, a recliner with a TV tray folded against the wall. Kitchen to the left. He knelt by the pistol, not touching it. 22 looked like. Breathing deeply, he stood, smelled disinfectant and mildew. Only here once, and he still remembered it. He closed the door, careful not to step in the blood, and crossed the room to where the dark hall stretched out of sight. He switched on the light. There were 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, door at the end. A shotgun house. He remembered the first room as Larry's as he walked along the wall, the gun cabinet halfway down the hall empty of rifles and shotguns, piled instead with mail and books. In Larry's room he turned on the light. Neat bed, tucked corners, paneled walls, shelves full of the books Larry had read as a kid, Stephen King hardbacks, Tarzan paperbacks, Conan the Barbarians, Harlan Ellison, Louis L'Amour, and others. Lots of them he'd never heard of. In one corner there was another pile of yellowing mail, hundreds of catalogs and sales circulars, a whole stack of Book of the Month Club catalogs, another of the Doubleday Book Club, the Quality Paperback Book Club, several stacks of old TV guides. Silas creaked the closet open and frowned at a row of suits and shirts, clothes of a boy on one end, and growing larger down the rod, a man on the other. A stack of uniforms on the floor, Larry on the shirt. In the bathroom he flipped past his reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. No prescription drugs. Just a tin of bare aspirin, rusting on the metal. Tube of toothpaste. No dental floss. Toilet bowl was clean of the ring Silas's had, which meant you needed to use some Comet or something. Even had one of those blue disinfectant things. Behind its curtain, the shower was clean, drain a little rusty, few hairs. Head and shoulders, nub of soap. Moving through the rest of the house, he opened drawers and looked under beds, but found nothing surprising. He left all the lights on and went out the back door and down the steps. He stood in the dark, listening to the birds and bugs. Out here wasn't what you'd call a backyard. It was more of a backfield. His cone of light showed more footprints, and he found an unmarred section of ground and walked to the gate and stopped. There it was. The barn. He stood leaning on the gate and saw himself years ago, the day he'd come here. No grown-ups, no teachers, no other girls or boys, black or white, just him and Larry. He remembered following Larry through the house, past the gun cabinet, rifles and shotguns standing in their racks. Remembered going out the back door and over the huge yard, rolling open the doors and going inside the barn. They climbed on the tractor and caught lizards. Anoles, Larry had called them, then quickly added, but some people call them lizards too. They incarcerated, Larry's word, the anoles in an aquarium Larry found in a dark, cluttered room Silas didn't enter. They found what Silas proclaimed a cottonmouth moccasin, but Larry called a chicken snake, woven around the rafters under the eaves, and Larry took its tail and unwrapped the snake as it snapped at him and shot out its tongue. He grabbed it behind its neck and held it, enormous and gray, patterned with darker green ovals, longer than either boy. Did Silas want to hold it? Hell no. It had a bulge like a softball in its stomach, and Larry said it must have eaten a rat or something. He said there were big rats in the barn. Silas said, why didn't they keep the snake incarcerated too? And they did, in a gallon jar, alongside their aquarium. Silas had said, like a reptile house, and Larry had said, a herpetarium. Now, Silas took a deep breath and remembered the watermelon aroma of cut grass. He played his light over the yard, moaned close, then turned back to the barn and followed the beam of light to the bay door and rolled it open. He slipped inside the dark, recalling the snake in the mailbox and trying to remember if snakes hung around after dark. His flashlight threw the tractor's shadow on the far wall and then probed the ground. No boards, just soft dirt. Rat waddling away. The lawnmower handle sticking out, wrapped in black electrical tape. A chainsaw hanging on a nail. He saw a door on the left side and heard movement within it. A stirring. His heart beat faster. For a latch, the door had a slab of a 2x4 nailed in the wall. He moved his light to his right hand and slid his .45 from its holster with his left, easing up on the door. That smell. What was it? For a moment, he imagined it was a body. Aiming the pistol with a stiff arm, he used the flashlight to turn the latch down, and when he did, the door swung open and the noise stopped. He poked his head in, and a hen fluttered in his light, and he yelped and his pistol discharged and set all the other birds aflight. Shit, he said, laughing. The chickens agreed. He was waiting on Larry's porch, listening to the wind chime, when Angie called. Said she and Tab were headed to the bus, if he wanted to join them. If he could, he would, he said. A while later, French's Bronco came bouncing up, blinding him with its lights, and pulled to a stop beside his Jeep. The CI got out, adjusting his sidearm, holding a plastic bag with something in it. He went to the back of his Bronco, careful where he stepped, and raised the shell and lifted his heavy black investigator's kit out and joined Silas on the porch. He had a cigarette hanging from his lower lip and set the bag down. How is he? Not dead, French said. He held up a bag with keys, a wallet, and cell phone in it, and exhaled smoke from his nose, and shook his head at, perhaps, the general nature of things. Lost a shitload of blood. So I seen. French pointed to the concrete walkway, heading over the yard, a series of small sneaker prints, in blood, going away from the house, each dimmer than the one before. There's Angie. Silas put his hat on and crossed the porch with his own light, fanning it out into the yard. People often covered their fingerprints, he knew, and destroyed bloody clothing and hid weapons, but they rarely thought of the simplest and oldest evidence in the world, footprints, or tire prints. French knelt at the end of the sidewalk with his light, reading the runes and ruts, a cigarette smoking in his fingers. Silas came to the top of the steps. French turned his light.
Hold up your bootsole toward me.
Silas did. Yep, this would be you. French reached in his shirt pocket and withdrew a clump of thick rubber bands. Put these on your feet, he said, and watched as Silas stretched the bands over the thickest part of his foot. French also had them over his own shoes. Any foot without a band wouldn't be law enforcement and would require investigation. Sorry, Chief, Silas said. He ashed a cigarette in his palm and blew it into the wind. You will be, when I make you mold these motherfuckers. Not bothering to put out his smoke, French hefted his investigator's kit, and Silas followed him inside. The CI pulled out a chair from under the kitchen table and set the plastic bag and kit there, and stood, pushing his hands in the small of his back until it clicked. In the living room they stared at the floor. The blood had dried to the color of molasses, and the room had an unpleasant tang. French picked up the pistol by its barrel. It left a smear of blood, and examined it, ejected the cylinder. 22, he said. Fired once? He turned it. The serial number's about rubbed off. He replaced it and stood. Sheriff Lawley took Art's gun privileges away after his daddy got killed. He ain't even supposed to have any firearms at all. Took 'em away how? Just did it. They went to the gun cabinet in the hall, gazed down at its stacks of old magazines on the green lining. French opened the drawer at the bottom. More mail. Maybe Art moonlit as a postman. Where'd they go? Silas asked. All the guns. County auctioned them off, I expect. So where'd he get that pistol? If it was his, pawn shop. Gun show. It's an old model. Could have had a dozen owners. I'll run a trace, but it'll be a dead end. He fished his camera from his pocket. Bullet entry was straight in, he said, clicking through the pictures, Silas moving to see. Shots of Larry's pale face, obscured by the oxygen mask. The chief did a miniature slideshow. Shots of Larry on a table in his mechanic's uniform, bloodied at the chest. Larry's shirt being scissored off, an IV going into his arm, close-ups of the wound, tear marks and blackened skin. My guess, French said. Self-inflicted. More shots. His pants being cut off, his egg-white legs, people in scrubs and masks, the keys and wallet, cell phone, money fanned out, close-up of Larry's driver's license. Could have surprised a crackhead, Silas said. Maybe. French still studying the pictures. But he still had his wallet on him. And seen the burns here? On the shirt, skin? That indicates a close-range shot. Inches, probably. He left Silas at the table and walked over to the television, an ancient mahogany cabinet model with an actual knob you turned. He looked behind the console. I believe our victim here is the last resident in Mississippi without a remote control. Or cable. He walked to the window and fingered the flat wire that ran from the back of the TV out the window, up to the antenna. No answering machine? Ain't got a computer either. So? Unusual fella. A frozen in the 1960s kind of character. For instance, he said, you ever go in his shop? It's old-timey shit. Turns his rotors by hand. No power tools. Uses a hand jack. Go in Cohen's up the road yonder, and he's got air ratchets, uses compressors and computers and shit. Engine light comes on, power window stops working, fuel injectors clogged, replace the fucking computer. That's all they do now. Just take one computer chip out and put another one in. It's all computers now. Larry Ott don't need to upgrade if he ain't got any business. They stood looking. Silas said, maybe he can't get cable out here. He could get a fucking dish. Guess he reads books instead. Reads books. They stood looking over the room. Chief, Silas said, maybe you're right. He crossed to a shelf and picked up something he hadn't seen yet, a direct TV brochure that listed the advantages and channels. French came over beside him and touched the spine of one of the books with his gloved knuckle. "Into horror and shit. There's a lot more of these in that first bedroom. More in all the bedrooms but the parents'. More books, I bet you, than in the rest of the county combined, including the library." French went down the hall, but Silas remained for a moment. He remembered this book, could see it in Larry's hands as Larry described the plot. For a moment the two boys were out in the woods, walking, carrying their rifles. Silas found French in Larry's parents' bedroom, the CI opening drawers. He stopped at the one piled with a woman's clothes. "Except for that front room, this place don't look no different than it did when I was last here last week. My guess is he ain't touched this particular room since his mama went to the home." "Ain't nothing weird about that." "I didn't say it was weird. My stepsister's mother died, and she won't let nobody go in her room except for her. Sometimes she stays in there singing bar skag songs, so don't get me started on weird." Back in the kitchen, French opened the refrigerator. "Here's something," he said. Silas looked past him. A case of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer among the eggs and containers of fast food. One can missing. "Larry's been a non-drinker his whole life. His daddy died in a drunk driving accident." "Maybe he started." "Maybe." French went to the table and examined the surface, then took a towel from the top of the kit and spread it out, and began to poke around in the black leather satchel. It reminded Silas of an old-time country doctor's bag, but bigger. He'd envied this kit. But when he requisitioned the town council for a less expensive set, they'd denied the request. French was rewinding a tape on his recorder video camera, his head in a cowl of smoke. "You remember how to mold?" "Yeah." "It's some packets in my case. Hardener, too. Go get every print you don't know, front and back." Silas carried the aerosol can of dirt hardener, 3 wooden frames, and 3 of the prepackaged molding kits outside. The kits were plastic bags of water, about the size of a bag of powdered sugar, with a smaller pack of cement inside you could feel sloshing around. He put the stuff on the porch and, with his light, began to examine the tracks of his Jeep, French's Bronco. The rain had pretty much obliterated any other vehicle's tracks. There were several footprints, full and partial. He ignored his own and Angie's, but found one near the front of the walkway. He set the frame around it and got one of the bags from the porch. He pushed on it until he found the cement packet inside and squeezed with his thumbs. Began to knead the bag, mixing the cement and water. Then he sprayed the mud with the hardener and tore open one end of the bag and began to pour it carefully over the footprint, and then arranged the first frame. In the rear he found another set of footprints, and repeated the operation. When he came back in, French had bagged the gun and was lifting prints. "Here," he said. "Label these." They spent nearly an hour cataloging the prints, French saying he imagined they were all Larry's. Then the chief used distilled water and cotton balls to get blood samples, but found no blood, other than the big patch on the living room floor, and that on the pistol. Finally they went down the hall and out the back door and stood looking at the barn as the night screamed with its birds and frogs and bugs. "You looking there?" French said, aiming his cigarette at the barn. "Yeah." "Got bushwhacked by a flock of hens." French snorted. In the barn, the chickens were making their noises. French probed the dark, dusty corners with his Mac light, looking for freshly disturbed dirt, loose boards, blood, hair, or the thing you'd only know once you saw it. "Looks the same," he said. He went in the feed room and opened the chicken roost door and aimed his light. They looked a while longer, then went back out and lifted the heavy concrete molds and set them in French's Bronco. Then the chief X'd the door with yellow tape, and they stood in the shadow of the barn, the CI emitting bursts of smoke that hung in the still air like sheets on a line. Silas thought he heard an owl somewhere, and remembered Larry telling him you called baby owls owlets. "Tomorrow," French said, "I'm going to head up to Oxford, talk to the sheriff, interview some of the Rutherford girls' friends, boyfriend, Maybe a professor or two. He dropped his cigarette and crushed it out with his foot, picked it up. In the morning, after your traffic, why don't you run back out here? Get a better look around. There's probably more tracks you can get molds of. Just do a general walk around. I think Art has like 300 acres left. You think this might be connected with the Rutherford girl? I ain't ruling it out, French said. But you've been wanting some real police work. Here's your chance. They taped the back doors of the barn and the house and went around the side. On the front porch, Silas reached in to turn off the lights. Then he waited as French taped the door and locked it and tossed him Larry's keys and cell phone. Get these back when you're done. And let me know if you find anything. Right. When he wakes up, we'll go talk to him. In the yard, French hoisted his bag into the back of his Bronco. Keep them other 2 mold kits, he said. You might need 'em tomorrow. Okay. You want me to call Shannon? No. She'll find out soon enough. He stretched. I'm going home. Silas put Larry's stuff on the kitchen table of his trailer and laid his gun belt beside it, glad to be free of its weight. The handcuffs, flashlight, extra clips. He opened the refrigerator and drew a Budweiser from the nearly empty 12-pack and got a glass from the drying rack by the sink. During his Navy stint, he'd drunk beer in several countries, including England, where they drank it warm, or Belgium, where they have specialized glasses for each type, or Brazil, where the beer comes in giant bottles you split with your table mates, drinking from small glasses. He'd kept the latter habit here, but only in private. In the bus, he drank from bottles because people would think a glass affected. He took the short water glass he liked and the bottle into the living room and set them on the coffee table. He sank back on the old sofa and pulled off his boots to let his socked feet breathe. He couldn't afford a washer or dryer, and usually took his clothes to Angie's on the weekends. He popped off the beer cap and filled the glass and drained it, then poured the rest of the bottle in and put the empty on the coffee table and looked across the room to where his and Larry's keys lay side by side. He finished the beer, got the last one from the fridge, and went down the hall, unbuttoning his shirt with one hand. In his room he sat on the bed, unmade, and looked at his nightstand, over which he'd thrown a white T-shirt. He glanced at his watch. 11 p.m. Maybe he'd call Angie, say he was too beat to meet her. He filled his glass and drank, then set it and the bottle on the floor, and lay back and pulled the T-shirt from his nightstand and looked at the answering machine. The light was blinking. He reached over and pressed play. Silas? He sat up. I'm sorry to bother you, Larry Ott's voice said. I know you're busy, but please call me back when you can, even if it's late. It's Monday morning, and I'm at the shop. As Silas listened, he gazed across the shag carpet that had been here when he'd bought the place, and that he kept meaning to rip up. And the closet? Behind his 2 extra uniforms, where he wouldn't have to look at it, was the Marlin lever-action .22 rifle. Larry recited his shop number, slowly, as if he were giving the code to disarm a bomb. Then he said, Please call back, even if it's late. It's kind of important, but I don't want to say it over the phone. Thank you. Call back, even if it's late. Well, it was late, wasn't it, Larry? Too late. Chapter 5. Larry woke before his mother knocked. It was a Saturday, the first day of summer, school out and 3 long months of freedom ahead of him. He dressed quickly in the clothes he'd chosen the night before, an old T-shirt and blue jeans with the knees out, perfect for getting dirty. He stuck his lock blade knife in his back pocket and tied his sneakers and was down the hall and out the front door before anyone saw him. He hopped onto his bicycle where he leaned it by the porch and kicked away pedaling. He flew down the driveway through the trees, dodging puddles and watching for snakes. He passed the Walker place, Cecil on the porch with a cup of coffee and a cigarette that he raised. Larry waved back and kept going, skidding to a stop before the mailboxes, theirs and the Walkers'. Without dismounting, He opened the little door and pulled out the letters and circulars. He got Cecil's, too, glancing at it. Where Larry sometimes had mail, comic books or magazines, things he'd ordered, Cindy Walker never did. The Walkers usually only got junk. Cecil was gone when he rode back by, and he left their circulars on the porch. At home, he laid his father's mail on the kitchen table and took his seat. In a moment, the back door closed and his mother came in the kitchen with several eggs in her apron. "You scared me," she said. "Sorry." She began to lay the eggs on the counter and noticed the mail. "Did your funny books come?" "No, ma'am." "Maybe Monday." Because it was warm, she was barefoot. She lit a match and touched it to the burner, and a flame bloomed to life. Smell of natural gas, piped from the big metal tank in the backyard, filled once a month by a truck. "How was your breathing last night?" she asked, rinsing the eggs. "Fine." "Good." "Good." She was opening drawers, lighting another burner. "You want fried?" "Yes, ma'am." Something banged in the back of the house, and they exchanged a look. Then the television clicked on, and the newscaster's voice grew louder as Carl raised the volume, part of his morning ritual, watching the news and reading the mail while he ate. A moment later he came into the kitchen, tucking his green short-sleeved uniform shirt into his blue jeans, another sign of Saturday. The rest of the week he wore matching green pants. He often grumbled about having to work on Saturday, but Larry knew he preferred it to being here. And on any other Saturday, Larry would have been anxious to go with him. But not today. "Good morning, Daddy," he said, once a commercial came on, the television visible only from Carl's end of the table. His father was spreading the mail in front of him. "Morning." His mother appeared at Carl's elbow with a ceramic coffee pot and poured his cup full. "Thank you." He reached for the sugar and poured a huge amount in. She lingered at his elbow. "Honey?" He sipped and noticed them both looking at him. The usual Saturday ritual, the two of them teaming up on him, asking without words if Larry would be able to go to the shop today. Today, though, Larry was relieved when his father looked back at the letter in his hand and said, "Got a busy one, Ina. 2 transmissions and a carburetor. He won't do nothing but get in the way." Behind them, the frying pan on the stove began to sizzle. "Okay, Daddy," Larry said. "Maybe next week," said his mother. One thing Carl had made clear long ago, to both of them, was that no meant hell no from the get-go. In a moment his mother set Larry's eggs before him, and he salted them and ate them quickly, and his bacon too. When he finished, he felt his father's eyes on his plate and said, "Can I be excused?" "What'd you tell your mama?" "Enjoyed it. Go on." He went down the hall toward his room, but heard his father call, "Hey, boy." He hurried back. "Yes, sir?" "You stay outside today. Cut the grass." Which meant don't read all day. "Yes, sir." He went down the hall and picked up the paper sack of trash, heavy with last night's beer bottles, and carried it outside and put it in the back of his father's truck, where Carl would throw it in his trash can at the shop. He was lugging the push mower out of the barn when Carl drove past in the red Ford and slowed to a stop, lowering his window. "Don't run over no sticks with that mower," he called. "I just sharpened the blade." "Yes, sir." He waved as his father drove away, then turned to face their 3-acre yard, the house centered in it, and the barn back by the trees. Half a day's work at least. "Darn," he whispered. Might as well get it done with. That way he could salvage the second half of the day and not get in trouble. He added gas to the mower and checked the oil. It cranked on his first pull, and he began to push it along the edge of the driveway, shooting grass, small rocks, and mangled sticks out the side, glad again that school was over. Next year, he'd go to Folsom, the only public high school in the county. As he pushed the mower, he thought how Alice's car must have come from Carl, but Larry knew not to say more about it. He'd failed Carl before, by not understanding that the black woman and her son had been their secret. He should have known that men do not discuss with their wives or mothers the business that is their own. Since he'd given Silas his .22, He now carried a Model 94 lever-action .33 that, of all their guns, most closely resembled the .22. Though his mother couldn't have named a difference if you'd lain the rifles side by side, his father would have noticed if Larry began to carry a gun without a lever, a pump shotgun, or one of the single-shot or automatic rifles. For the past spring, whenever he'd been able to, Larry would race through the woods with this rifle toward the cabin. Each time Silas would jump out with a .22, a good-natured ambush, Larry understanding that Silas would have been waiting for him no matter how long it took him to get there, the black boy always breaking into his big grin. As it had grown warmer, as the school year had progressed, Silas had abandoned the coat and gloves from Larry, and Larry saw he now wore better clothes. His mother, with her 2 jobs, a waitress in the Folsom Diner and a cafeteria worker in the grocery store, buying them at the TG&Y. The boys would shoot their rifles, play mumbly peg with Larry's knife, play chase, war, cowboys and Indians, climb trees. With Silas on Larry's bike, racing back and forth, doing wheelies, skidding, Larry ran along behind with his stick, looking for snakes sunning on the road. When they found one, a black snake, a hognose, Larry would pin its head to the dirt with a stick and grab the snake behind its neck, holding it as it wrapped itself around his wrist and shot out its tongue. Silas always kept his distance as Larry stuffed the snakes into the pillowcase he carried. In April, they began to fish in the creek on the other side of the cabin. In one of the rooms in their barn, Larry's father had several rods and reels on nails on the wall and a giant tackle box, and as long as he was careful, Larry was allowed to use the equipment. As they walked, loaded down with rods and reels, the tackle box, their rifles, Silas asked if Larry was going out for baseball this year. Larry said he wasn't. He'd never played, had never even considered it. How come? I ain't no good. At the creek's widest point, he showed Silas how to bait a hook, throw the cork out, catch and clean a fish, how to use artificial bait, rubber worms, brokeback minnow, snagless sallies, silver spoons, plugs, but these were for bass, which were few in the creek and hard to catch, and so mostly they used corks and sinkers, for this was what the big gray catfish that sucked along the bottom of the creek preferred. Larry had tried to get Silas to take their first stringer of these fish home to his mother, several pounds, but Silas said he couldn't. Why not? Larry was sitting on the creek bank, watching his cork, the water roiling and bubbling as the fish pulled at the stringer. Silas, fascinated at what they'd hooked from the creek, raised the stringer to gape at the prehistoric faces, their wide mouths, flat heads. Why not? Larry asked again. Mama, she say I ain't supposed to play with you. Why? Silas just shrugged. The catfish croaked, and Silas splashed them into the water. What's that? Larry smiled at him. That's how they talk. He pulled them up again. Careful of that long fin there, Larry said. It'll stick you. Silas lowered his face to the catfishes. What you sayin', Mr. Catfish? Is it 'cause I'm white? Larry asked. What? Why your mama don't want you to play with me? I don't know. She didn't tell you? She just say, don't you go near that boy. Made me promise I wouldn't. How come? I done said I don't know. Larry was puzzled. It had to be his color. What else could it be? He'd known his own father would disapprove. He would never tell Carl about the friendship. But wouldn't it be different for Silas? Wouldn't a black woman be happier son had a white friend? They'd given them coats, a car. He'd assumed the anger that black folks felt was a reaction to white people's attitude toward them. Y'all started it. But if somebody white was willing to befriend somebody black, offer them gifts, even a place to live, shouldn't the blacks be grateful? You ever tell her about that rifle? Hell no. I keep it hid. How come? 'Cause she'll make me give it back. I do need it back, Larry said, for my daddy goes looking for it. Here, he said, offering his knife. I'll trade you this. A knife for a gun? Please. Tell me one of them stories, Silas said. He meant a Stephen King story. Larry had lent Silas books, but the black boy said he didn't like reading. Homework was enough. Weren't lights in the cabin anyhow. Just an oil lamp and candles. A flashlight. Silas did, however, like to hear Larry describe the stories. Now he told about the one called Trucks, where a supernatural force has taken over all the trucks at an interstate exit, and presumably all over the world, and a bunch of people are trapped in a diner, surrounded by murderous vehicles. Near the end, the trucks start blowing their horns, and one of the survivors recognizes that it's Morse code. Silas was threading a worm onto his treble hook. What's that? Larry had described the dot and dash code, then told how the trucks were honking in Morse that somebody needed to fill them up with gas. The story ended with the people serving the trucks, taking turns filling them with gas, the guy telling the story looking up at two airplanes. I hope to God, he'd said, that there are people in them. Silas had been watching the sky. Larry finished the grass just before noon, and for lunch, his mother made him a potted meat and mayo sandwich with saltines on the side. He read a comic book at the table while he ate, then drained his glass of Coke and thanked her, and got his .33 from the gun cabinet in the hall, and 2 boxes of cartridges, and Stephen King's short story collection, Night Shift, and at the front door called, I'm going outside, and let the screen door bang behind him, feeling her coming out behind him, watching him. As always, he headed toward Cindy's house to throw her off, shoulder-strapped the Marlin and walked down along the road. Once around the bend, he doubled back, went east. Because Silas had started playing baseball at school, Larry worried that he was losing him. He'd invited him to his house once, and they played in the barn, and Silas had cut the grass, but he knew the black boy wouldn't do that again. Maybe he could take him back through the woods, toward Cindy's house. She'd been his secret, but maybe it was time to share her. Half an hour later, he knelt at the edge of the woods, rifle unshouldered. From across the field he watched Silas standing on a pile of dirt he'd mounded behind the cabin. He looked back over his shoulder toward Larry, who ducked before he realized Silas was just checking an imaginary runner on first. Then he raised both his hands to his chest and kicked up one leg and fired a streak of gray toward the tree 60 feet away. Larry was impressed at the thwack the ball made when it bounced off the trunk and rolled back. Silas was already charging to scoop the baseball bare-handed out of the weeds and pretend to throw it back in Larry's direction, as fluid a move as an Atlanta Brave on the television. His mother's car was nowhere in sight, which meant she was working. Around the cabin, the field that had been so dead and gray in winter was now greening, butterflies doddering over the goldenrod and orb spiders centered in their webs like the pupils of eyes. Back on the mound, Silas checked runners on first and second before he pitched, and then he did it all again. Larry sat back against a tree and picked beggar's lice off his socks and pants. He'd hear the thump the ball made, then maybe a grunt or hoot from Silas, but soon he opened Night Shift to one of his favorite stories, The Mangler. When he looked up, Silas was standing over him, his chest rising and falling. You spying? Larry closed his book. He saw the cat a few feet behind Silas and realized it had probably smelled him and come over, Silas following it. No. Larry shrugged and got to his feet and looked down at the rifle. I just come to see you, but you was busy throwing. Silas watched him. He still held his baseball, and Larry wondered, did he steal it from school? Silas looked back toward his mound, the tree. I bet I can throw 70, 80 miles an hour, he said. Yeah, Larry said. It looked real fast from here. What you reading? Larry held the book up. Its cover showed a human hand with eyes in the palm and on the fingers. Some of the hand and fingers were wrapped in gauze, like a mummy. Silas said, Is it scary? Larry told him about the Mangler, describing in great detail the scene when the detectives go to visit the girl who cuts her finger on the laundry machine. If the detective's far-fetched theory is accurate, a freakish confluence of events caused the machine nicknamed the Mangler to become possessed by a demon. The last piece in the puzzle, Larry told Silas, is the blood of a virgin. So the cops finally asked the girl, "Are you a virgin?" "I'm saving myself for my husband," she tells them. By then it's too late, and the mangler is coming for them all. Silas frowned. "What's a virgin?" "Somebody that hadn't ever had intercourse." "Intercourse? You mean somebody ain't never been fucked?" "Yeah." "Tell me another one," Silas said. But now they were walking, the rifle strapped to Larry's back, Silas grinding his baseball into his palm. He told about Jerusalem's Lot, and told how it was a precursor to King's novel, Salem's Lot. "That's the one I was reading that first day I met you, when we picked y'all up. You remember?" "I don't remember no book." Larry shrugged. "Where we going anyway?" Silas asked. "I don't want to go to your house." They were in the woods a quarter-mile from Larry's barn, skirting it and heading toward the Walker place. "I want to show you something," Larry said. "Somebody." "Who?" "You'll see." "A girl?" "A real pretty one." "Who is she?" "Our closest neighbor," Larry said. "Her stepdaddy, Cecil, he's a funny man, always doing crazy things." "Crazy how?" Larry stopped, Silas behind him, and began to tell about the New Year's Eve a couple of years before, when the Walkers had come over and Carl had brought a bunch of fireworks. Trying to pause when his father did, Larry told how the mothers were in the house talking and cooking a chicken, and Larry, Cindy, Carl, and Cecil were outside with the fireworks. Both men were drunk, and it was one of the happiest memories Larry had. Yellow and red smoke bombs, Roman candles, even Cindy, usually so aloof, laughing as Cecil goofed off and held his fizzing bottle rockets in his hand, one or two exploding before he threw them, which had everybody laughing as he shook his hand, burnt black and smoking. He had a bundle sticking out of his coat pocket, fuse end up, and he'd quick draw them and light them and fling them out. Carl wasn't shooting, just watching from the porch steps with his beer and cigarette. Cecil lit another with a kitchen match and let it sizzle. Cindy was a few feet away, 14 years old and with pigtails, squatting in blue jeans and a sweater beside her Coke bottle, holding a cigarette lighter to a rocket of her own. "Hey, Sin," Cecil said, and when she looked up, he flicked the lit bottle rocket at her. She shrieked and jumped aside as it zipped past her and blew up in the field. "Cecil, you mean," she said, as he quick drew another and lit it, flicking it at her. "Dance!" he yelled, like a gunslinger shooting at her feet. "You gon' deafen that girl," Carl called, "or blind her one." Larry stepped back, behind Cecil, and watched as he lit another and let it fly at her. This time it did hit her, as she ran away from him, out into the darkness. It exploded against her back and she screamed, Carl starting down off the steps, and Larry heading out to see if she was okay. In a panic, glancing back toward the house, Cecil dropped his match. Cindy was crying and the women came out onto the porch, just in time to see that she was fine. It had bounced off her and exploded in the grass. But the match Cecil dropped had landed in his coat pocket where the bottle rockets were. Him so drunk, he just looked around and said, "Something's burning." "It's your coat, Cecil," Larry said, pointing. Cecil raised his arm and looked down as the first bottle rocket hissed out of his pocket into the air. Bang! Then another. He flung his arm back and yelled as another flew out, and another, his coat ablaze now. The sound Larry heard his father laughing as Cecil began to run, yelling, beating at his coat and more rockets taking off. Then Cindy was laughing, and Larry was, and even the women, Sheila covering her mouth with both hands as Cecil wrenched off the coat, still spraying its fireworks, and began to stomp it, laughing himself now, falling. Larry laughing now, telling it. But not Silas. Larry had heard Carl tell the story before and have the men at his shop howling. Cecil hardest of all, in stitches, nodding that, yep, it was true, he'd burn up his own damn coat, plus got in Dutch with the old lady. But Silas never broke a smile. "Sound more mean than crazy," he said. "I don't know if I want to go see a man like that." Larry tugged his sleeve. "Come on." As they got closer to the edge of the woods that bordered the Walker property, Larry put a finger to his lips and knelt and began to creep. Behind, Silas did the same. They were coming up an incline, and just before the house came in sight, Larry lay flat on his belly. Silas hesitated, as if he didn't want to mess up his clothes, but finally lay alongside Larry, and together they peered out of the woods. 50 yards away, the Walker house was a dirty, uneven rectangle, with a series of ill-planned additions covered in black tar paper curling at the edges. Between two of the rooms was a rudimentary deck, and here was where Cindy often sunbathed. Today, though, Cecil stood on the deck with Carl himself. "That's your daddy," Silas said. "What's he doing there?" Larry had no idea. Carl was smoking a cigarette and talking the way he did at his shop and drinking a bottle of beer, Cecil listening. He had sawyerd in the mill until he hurt his back, and now he got a small disability, which he used for beer and cigarettes. "Let's go," Larry whispered. He began to slide back. "Hang on." Silas grabbed his arm. "We snuck this far. Maybe that girl'll come out." They waited, huddled on the ground. Larry caught a word now and again as they matched each other beer for beer and seemed fairly drunk when Cindy finally burst out onto the deck. Larry froze in the leaves. They watched as Cindy stood on the porch, wrapped in a small towel, with another one turbaned on her head. She was arguing with Cecil, one arm waving in the air and the other clenching her towel at her chest. She raised her voice. "Mama said I could go!" Her mother, Larry knew, worked evenings at the tie factory over in East Folsom. "What'd you say her name was?" Silas whispered. "I seen her at school." "Cindy." She was getting madder on the deck, raising her voice. Cecil leaned over and nudged Carl and reached out and tugged at Cindy's towel. She slapped Cecil's hand, but he held on and pulled harder, Carl laughing, rising from his seat on the steps to stand leaning against the rail. A better view, more cleavage, half her bosom showing. "Cecil!" Cindy shrieked. "Let go! I'll tell Mama!" He murmured something, clinging to the towel. He winked at Carl, who was scratching his cheek and taking a long pull from his beer, Cindy's towel inching up her thigh and down her chest as she slapped at Cecil's hand. Silas was out of the leaves and halfway across the yard, brushing dirt from his knees, before Larry realized he was gone from his side. Striding away, he seemed taller than he had when they'd met. Still frozen, Larry watched Silas walk up to the two drunk white men, on the porch, both speechless at his appearance. "Y'all leave that girl alone," he said. Cecil let go of Cindy, and she cinched up her towel and stood watching the black boy down in their yard, as speechless as everybody else. Then she turned and went inside, the door slamming behind her. The noise startled Cecil. "Who are you, boy?" But Silas was walking, around the deck and house, heading for the road. "Wait!" Carl was saying. "Hey, boy!" He came down the steps with his bottle and circled the house, but Silas had sprinted away, gone for good. Larry began to inch down the land in the rustling leaves like a reptile, and lay breathing hard at the bottom. He was about to rise with his rifle and trudge home, when above him, Carl stepped into the tree line. He stood gazing about, maybe looking to see were there more black boys in the woods, and Larry lay flat, thankful for his camouflage. Carl kinked his hip and unzipped his fly and reached into his pans. Larry looked away as his father hosed out piss that crackled in the dry leaves like a fire. When he finished, he stood a moment. "Hey, Carl!" It was Cecil. "Any more natives down yonder? Don't get stalled by no spear." When Larry opened his eyes, his father was gone from the top of the hill. He found Silas flinging his baseball at a stout magnolia and fielding the returns. "Thanks for helping her," he said. Silas wound up and threw into the tree. Instead of fielding, he let the ball die in the weeds. "You always spying on people," he said. "I don't spy." "You ever take that girl on a date?" Larry didn't answer. You wasn't gonna help her. I wanted to. Silas watched him a moment, then got his ball and began to walk toward home, and Larry followed. It was cooler in the woods, and they crunched over the leaves and ducked branches. At one point, when the brush cleared, Silas sprinted ahead and turned, still running, and pivoted and threw the baseball back toward Larry. Larry reached for it, but closed his eyes and missed, and it bounced behind him and disappeared. Shit, Silas said. He hurried past Larry and began looking for the ball. Larry knew something was wrong when he walked in the back door, on his way to place the .33 in its green velvet slot in the gun cabinet in the hall. Carl sidestepped out of the kitchen to face him. Come here, he said. Larry willed himself to walk toward his father, who seized him by his sleeve and dragged him into the living room. He took the rifle from Larry. Where's my Marlin? Larry looked down at his hands. Get it, his father said. Larry didn't move. Boy, I ain't got it, Daddy. Ain't got it, Daddy. Yes, sir. I mean, no, sir. Larry's mother was behind them now. Carl? She said. Carl held up his finger to her and looked at his son. Where's my dad-blame rifle, boy? Larry was kneading his fingers. I let my friend use it. Friend, his father said. I didn't know you had none. Carl, Ina Jean, this boy's subcontracting out my firearms. I want to know who it is. Well? Larry didn't answer. I ain't asking again. That boy we picked up? What boy? Silas. Silas, his father said. Silas, that nigger boy? Carl? His father moved his face so close, Larry could smell beer and cigarettes, and in that moment, he knew that Carl had seen him at the bottom of the hill. Just a dad-blame minute. You give my gun to your nigger friend. Carl, stop it. He looked at his wife, pointing her finger. Carl Ott, I said stop it right now. His father let Larry's sleeve go. Maybe you're right. You want to have him over for dinner after church? She said, you're just... Tomorrow. Carl told Larry. Tomorrow, first thing, you get your ass out there where they're squatting and get my goddamn Marlin back. Is that clear, boy? Carl, your language... Ina Jean, this is not the time. Then when is? How long they gonna live there, Carl? Shut your mouth. It ain't proper. Larry had wedged himself into the corner behind his father's chair. Proper, his father said. If they don't leave, his mother said, then me and Larry are. Tonight. For a moment it seemed his father might laugh. Then he just shook his head. Don't tempt me, he said. Carl, she whispered. He flopped a hand at Larry. When you able to come out of the corner, Carl, just get the gun back, he said through his teeth. Whether you're here tomorrow or not. He went up the hall to the front and banged open the screen door and went onto the porch, and the screen door closed slowly in his wake. Carl, she called, following him, peering through the screen. Where you going? From behind the chair, Larry couldn't hear what he said. That night, as she had every night of his life, his mother came into his room and sat on his bed. He was facing the wall and didn't turn around, even when he felt her hand, its familiar odor of dish soap, rest on his shoulder. Larry? He didn't answer. Son. During his attacks of asthma, she'd stayed up with him as he struggled to breathe. Nights were worse, rubbing Vicks on his chest, and they prayed together for the asthma to go away. When her rooster began to crow, he'd know the long nights were nearly over. In first grade, he told her how he'd asked Shelley Salter to marry him, sent her a note with 2 boxes drawn at the bottom, check yes or no. She checked no. Silly girl, his mother had said, rubbing his chest. Good-looking boy like you. If I wasn't your mother, I'd set my cap for you." In 2nd grade, the year he'd begun to stutter, he told her how the kids laughed at him, and she'd prayed the stuttering would go away. It hadn't. The asthma either. Both got worse. In the 3rd grade, the class read aloud, and Larry dreaded reading days. When he stuttered, the other boys laughed, and his teacher thought he was doing it on purpose and fussed at him. "It's my reading day tomorrow," he'd say as his mother sat on his bed. "Lord," she would pray, "thank you for your grace. Please help Larry read good tomorrow. Take that stuttering away, and please help his breathing tonight, and send him a special friend, Lord. One just for him." Eventually the prayers worked, but on a delayed schedule. "God's timing," his mother said, "is his own." The stuttering stopped late in the 4th grade, almost overnight, and only rarely recurred. His asthma subsided gradually, gone entirely by the end of the summer before 6th grade. And then Silas had come. A friend. Silas, who was the first answered prayer he couldn't tell her about, knowing that the chilly mother who'd given Silas and Alice Jones those coats would return, that she would do something to make them leave the cabin in the woods. Now her prayer had become, "Dear Lord, thank you for your grace, and thank you for healing Larry's stuttering and his asthma. Please send him a special friend, one just for him." Was continuing to pray for something you already had wrong? He'd even begun to worry his stuttering, his asthma might return. "Son?" He was still against the wall, and she took her hand from his shoulder. He didn't answer. She sat for a while longer. He breathed the smell of his room, the dust behind his bed. "Larry." Finally she sighed, and he felt her hand on his shoulder again. "Dear Lord," she prayed, "thank you for your grace. Thank you for healing Larry's stuttering and his asthma. Please," she said, and he heard that she was trying not to cry. "Please, God, send him a special friend. One just for him." "Amen," she said, and left. When he woke in the morning, his teeth were gritty. He'd gone to sleep without brushing. His mother was in the kitchen cooking breakfast, as if nothing had happened. Through his window he saw Carl's truck gone and wondered if he'd stayed at Cecil's all night. He slipped outside without eating breakfast and trotted all the way to Silas's with the book in his back pocket. From his spot behind a tree, he saw Silas's mother's car parked in front of the cabin, and waited until she came out of the house in her Piggly Wiggly uniform and a hairnet. An old cat that had been sleeping in the sun on the car hood rose and stretched as she scratched behind its ears. Then she shooed it off and got in the car, an old Chevy Nova with rust spots and no hubcaps. She turned its engine over a few times, but it finally started, and she backed up, the cat sitting in the dirt road watching. Presently Silas came out and hopped off the porch and began to throw his baseball. He had a glove now, somehow. Larry came out of the woods and walked up to where Silas stood waiting. "Hey," Larry said. "Hey." Larry looked around. Then he thrust out his hand. "I brought you this." Night shift. "I know you don't like to read, but these are all short stories, some just a few pages, so maybe you'd like to try them." Silas popped his ball into his glove and took the book and looked at it. "I need the 22 back," Larry said. "How come?" "I just do. Please, Silas." "Tell me how come. You got a lot of 'em. I ain't got but one." "I told you. I want it back." "No. We need it." "It's my daddy's." "It's my daddy's," Silas mocked. Larry had a lock-blade knife in the right back pocket of his jeans, and he slipped a finger into that pocket, knowing he'd never used the knife. Suddenly, even having it was a disadvantage. "You got," Silas said, then stopped. He looked past Larry toward the trees, and Larry followed his eyes, knowing what he would see. It was Carl, with a bottle of bourbon, walking toward them. "Hell!" he yelled. "I followed you, boy. Just right behind you. You never seen me. Not once. Drunk, I followed you, boy." He stumbled, but came on. "You ain't got the slightest idea what's around you. You and your monster books. In the olden days, you'd have been dead a long time ago. Some Indian cutting your throat or some gook with a grenade. You got it easy. Mama's boy reading the livelong day. Watch your cartoons, play with your dolls, read your funny books, but you can't unscrew a goddamn bolt to save your life, can't charge a dad-blame battery, and here when it comes to knuckles, you can't even get your own daddy's gun back from the boy that stole it." He arrived before them and looked down at Silas. "You don't like that, do you, boy?" Silas folded his arms over his chest, the glove in his right hand. He wouldn't look at Carl. "Answer me, boy." "No." "No, sir." "No, sir." "Why not?" Now he looked Carl in the face. "'Cause I ain't stole nothing." "Well, if you ain't stole nothing, then don't be offended." He took a long pull from his whiskey and screwed the lid back on and wiped his lips with his fingers.
"And if you ain't stole nothing,
I'll take it all back." He looked from one boy to the other. "Well, now," he said, "'pears like we got a dispute between the races here." He looked at Silas. "How old are you, boy?" 14. "Tell me who your daddy is." He waited. "I ain't gonna ask you again." "He dead." "Dead? Well, ain't that sad? And he didn't leave you no gun? Ain't that one of a daddy's duties? Leave his boy a firearm? Tell you boys what." Carl walked over to the tree and placed his hand on its trunk, scuffed from Silas's baseball, and eased himself down until he sat at its base with his legs crossed. "So, y'all both want the rifle. You remember the Bible? The story of King Solomon, wisest man ever. 2 women come before him with a baby, both claiming it. Know what he says? Says, cut that sumbitch in 2. Give each woman half." Carl mimed sawing through a baby and giving Larry one side, Silas the other, all the while talking. The one woman says, "Good, do it." And the other says, "No, don't kill that young'un. She can have it." And boom, mystery solved. What I'm getting at here, boys, is that y'all have put me in the position of Solomon. I got to slice me a baby. "I'll get the gun," Silas said. "Don't be so hasty, boy," Carl said, unscrewing the lid. "I just need me one of them light bulbs to go off over my head. Then we can figure this out. Oh, wait." He coughed and wiped the back of his hand over his mouth. "I got it. Y'all got to fight it out. Man to man, white to colored. Whichever one of y'all wins gets the gun." At first Silas folded his arms and turned to go, but Carl said if he did, he'd go tell his mother. Then when she came home, tired from her 2 shifts, she'd find Carl Ott waiting inside the house, a mite drunker too. "Fight," Carl said. Neither boy spoke. "Now, Larry here's a little older, but on the girly side, so I figure it's even." Silas said, "You can't make me." "Oh, I can't." "No." "No, sir." "If y'all don't fight," Carl said, stripping off his belt, which fell from his fist like a snake unrolling, "I'll whoop you both." Carl started forward with the belt back, and Silas came at Larry and pushed him, not too hard, and Carl stepped away, crouching like a handler at a cockfight. When Larry didn't push back, Silas pushed again, and Carl yelled, "Fight!" And Silas pushed a 3rd time, and this time Larry grabbed him in a half-hearted hug around Silas's middle. Silas brought his knee up in Larry's gut and Larry let go and fell, his belly on fire, his breath lost, grateful for that. Otherwise he'd be crying. "Get up," Carl said. He bowled over. "He down," Silas said. "Get your pansy behind up, boy," Carl said. He came forward swinging the belt and popped Larry's rump with it. Larry barely felt it over the shame swarming his cheeks. He saw his hands in the dirt as they pushed up. Silas had retreated a few steps. He crouched, ready, when Larry charged and sidestepped and tripped him and fell on his back, and they were wrestling on the ground, dull thuds in the dust, cloth tearing, grunts. From above he heard Carl telling them to bite if they want to. It's allowed. Kneeing in the nuts, allowed. Kidney punches, rabbit punches, check, check. Eye gouging, go ahead, fight dirty, the whole time swigging from his bottle, until finally Silas had Larry face down in the dirt. When the dust passed, it was over. A matter of seconds. Let go, Larry said, his voice muffled. "Looks like you won yourself a rifle, boy," Carl said. "Let me up," Larry said again, louder, a note of panic. Silas tightened his grip. "Listen at the little stuttering baby," Carl said. "Quit it, Silas," he cried. "Please." Silas held on. "You," Larry burbled. You nigger." Silas let him go and rose. He backed up with his hands open. Larry got to his knees, brushing dirt from his face, spitting. Tears were falling off his chin now, dripping into the dirt on his shirt. He stood to face Silas, and Silas looked different than Larry had ever seen him. His eyes now flashed the same fierceness the other black boys at school had, that the girl Carolyn had. He was already sorry, but knew it was too late. Because here came Silas, and Larry saw that Silas was fixing to hit him, now on his own, was coming around with his left hand, and Larry waited for it, closing his eyes, and then Larry's head popped, and the world blared with hot white noise and spots of light. When he opened his eyes, he was facing another direction. His knees had buckled, and he opened and closed his mouth, tasting blood, sorrier yet for what he'd called Silas and seeing, through his flooded vision, night shift, face down in the dirt. Somewhere behind him he heard their voices, and looked back to a world that would never be the same. Carl had dropped his bottle and begun to fall, hugging Silas for balance, the two dancing weirdly through the bitter weeds toward the house. Silas fighting to get away, nearly crying himself as he said,
"Let me go, Mr. Ott. Please."
And Carl slurring something in his ear that made Silas bat his hands away. He broke free and sprinted toward the far woods, and Larry was left alone, on the ground, in the weeds, with his father.